Summer Solstice Indigenous Festival and Music Awards, cooking and craft workshops, online marketplace and virtual powwow, drive-in movies and concerts. More at summersolsticefestivals.ca.
Know History is proud to be the inaugural sponsor of the traditional knowledge segments throughout the Summer Solstice Indigenous Festival. Through our partnership with the festival, we hope to honor and lift up traditional knowledge keepers so we can all better understand the Indigenous history of Turtle Island. We research, document, and share. Visit us at indigenous.knowhistory.ca.
Bonjour, Uki, Dansei, Abawestich, Ani. My name is Adam Northpagan, and I am the president of the Legacy of Hope Foundation. The startling announcement that ground-penetrating radar had located the bodies of 215 Indigenous children on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School has forced Canada to confront a grim reality, one which has been mired in confusion and guilt, both for those who didn't know and those who knew about the residential schools but remained complicit. However, for many Indigenous people, this discovery has served as a painful reminder of our history with colonial and genocidal policies enacted by the Canadian government to destroy Indigenous peoples. These policies have taken many forms, from the reserve system to Indian day schools and residential schools to the 60 scoop and child welfare system policies, among others. The resulting emotional trauma, individual and cultural shame, high rate of addictions and incarceration, violence, and the many missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, as well as Indigenous men and boys, are only some of the repercussions of these policies. When the National Inquiry into the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls decided to label these efforts genocide, it was not only validating towards the experiences of Indigenous people, but it also opened the path towards more understanding and healing. We are hopeful that similar positive developments will take place during this newly difficult time of truth-seeking. Even so, it is important that we take a moment to pause and reflect on the enormity of this tragedy. It has forced us to add yet another heartbreaking acronym into our lives, MMIC, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Children. The whole world watches as Canada's genocide is revealed. It's clear that even if it is a painful process, the truth can no longer remain hidden. For the sake of the international community, our nation-to-nation relationship, and ourselves, we must investigate these tragedies and honor these lives lost. In doing so, we also recognize the intrinsic value of each human life, including those of Indigenous children. In the many weeks, months, and years to come, more Indigenous children will be found and brought home. We at the Legacy of Hope Foundation know this is to be true because of our work with survivors for over 20 years. Revisiting the history is traumatic and distressing, to say the least, but we need to be ready to work in partnership with all Canadians to demand justice for these children. Our newly completed exhibition, Escaping Residential Schools, Running for Their Lives, is one such way to bridge this partnership. This exhibition gives a voice to 7 Indigenous survivors of the residential school system, either survivors who escaped or are now sharing their testimony, or those who are sharing on behalf of those who went missing or did not survive the schools. Their testimony is also available on the Legacy of Hope website. It also highlights findings that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports and includes research, news, and information contained in public commemoration projects. This exhibition includes a memorial wall that contains the names of Indigenous children that are known to have died while attending residential school. This list was compiled by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, a partner of the Legacy of Hope Foundation. The list of names of over 4,000 Indigenous children who did not survive the residential school, although we suspect there are many more names to be uncovered. For over 20 years, the LHF has collected over 700 residential school survivor testimonies, many of which include references to horrific abuses, maltreatment, neglect, missing and murdered Indigenous children, and missing or murdered babies born from rape. As a nation, these numerous tragedies must be confronted together. The Escaping Residential School exhibition joins the 20 other LHF residential school system exhibitions. These exhibitions are intended to support discussions that will raise awareness and encourage Canadians to acknowledge that many Indigenous children died while attending these schools, that many Indigenous children remain missing, that there remains known and unknown cemeteries and burial locations, that there are many unanswered questions, and that families and communities deserve answers in order to move towards healing and closure. Like all LHF exhibitions, Escaping Residential Schools is free to borrow with a loan agreement by contacting info@legacyofhope.ca for more information. By working together to uncover more truths and supporting each other with these findings, we are directly participating in the reconciliation and healing process. Reconciliation can only truly occur when every truth is revealed, acknowledged, and rectified. This includes confronting the genocide of Indigenous peoples, which no Canadian is exempt from. We cannot predict what form this will take place, whether there will be a national inquiry on the genocide of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian state or not. What we do know is that the truth will eventually be told to all Canadians, even if gradually, or has been the case since the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the 2019 National Inquiry into the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls reports. As we take this time to honor the hundreds of children found in just the last few weeks, I ask you to remember, they were your children, some as young as 3 years old, who were stripped away from their homes and their families, enduring a life of hardship we cannot possibly fathom or imagine. Above all else, remember this. This tragedy is another tragic instance of crimes and indignities that Indigenous peoples within Canada have been subjected to. I ask that all people commit to the very basic principle of ending crime against Indigenous peoples. Let there be no more missing and murdered Indigenous people in Canada. Let those who are lost, children, women and girls, men and boys, be found and laid to rest, to allow for future generations of Indigenous people to be given a full and bountiful life. I truly believe that together we can, as a nation, strive towards further reconciliation by addressing the reality of Indigenous peoples and ending the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Ultimately, regardless of our nationalities, Canadians remain united. Turtle Island, Canada is proud mosaic of peoples learning and evolving together. However, without an end to this inequality and genocide against Indigenous people, our nation will never truly heal as one. Only when we address racism and injustice today can we truly close those dark chapters in Canada's past and present story and begin writing something not new and innovative together, as was the original intention when we first came together and signed treaties with one another. Finally, we urge all Canadians and governments to work with us, the Legacy of Hope Foundation, survivors and intergenerational survivors, to ensure atrocities are recorded and acknowledged, and that measures are put in place for families, communities, and nations to ensure we are all given the tools to build a brighter tomorrow for future generations. Chief McWitch, thank you.
Bonjour, friends, relatives, survivors. Indigenous. I'm Murray Sinclair, former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I wanted to take an opportunity to speak to you for a few minutes about the situation that has come to the public's eye about the discovery of bodies at the residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia, here in Canada. When I was asked to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I thought that I had a pretty good idea of what to expect. My experience as a lawyer, as a judge, as the co-chair of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba in the early 1990s, had given me a considerable amount of information about what Indigenous people had experienced here in Canada. And I thought that residential schools were part of the story, but that there was a lot more that would relate to what was going on outside the community in this current day and age. Discovering what was going on in the schools, I thought, would be accomplished by listening to what survivors told us and recording their stories. And I undertook that part of the work openly, willingly, with a what I thought was a good understanding of what they were going to tell us. And they did share with us a great deal of information about their individual experiences in the schools, about having been taken away from their families at such young ages. We called our interim report, "They Came for the Children," for that very reason. We wanted to draw the attention of the Canadian public to the fact that the Government of Canada set out in a deliberate policy to remove the children away from their parents, from their communities, and from the influences of their elders, their brothers, their sisters, in order to indoctrinate them into a different culture. And they accomplished that to a large extent. By the thousands, children were taken away and placed in those institutions called residential schools. And we identified the people who were responsible for that policy, for those decisions. The Prime Minister of the day, Sir John A. Macdonald, led the way, but he was assisted in his public leadership by others. Egerton Ryerson, who had developed a proposal about public schools, himself said that public schools should be available for the little white children of the settlements and the colonies, because the Indigenous children were not smart enough, that they were inferior and couldn't be educated in the same way and would not be eligible to become leaders in Canadian society because they were so uncivilized and heathens and savages. But the stories from the survivors proved to be pretty horrendous. And one of the most common stories that we heard were from survivors who talked about the children who died in the schools and whose deaths they witnessed. We heard about children who died from accidents, children who died from beatings, children who died when they ran away and never returned. We heard about some of the children who even took their own lives. We heard about children who deliberately burned down the schools and in that way caused the deaths of children in the schools. And we heard about, of course, the abuses they experienced. We heard about the day-to-day violence that they experienced. But just as often, for every single one of them, we heard about the loneliness. We heard about the separation from their family. We heard about how they lost so much to what they experienced in the schools. But the one aspect of residential schools that really proved to be quite shocking to me personally was the stories that we began to gather of the children who died in the schools, of the children who died sometimes deliberately at the hands of others who were there, and in such large numbers. Survivors talked about, during the time that they were there, about children who suddenly went missing. Some of the survivors talked about witnessing children being buried in large numbers into mass burial sites. Some of the survivors talked about infants who were born to young girls at the residential schools who had been fathered by priests, having those infants taken away from them and deliberately killed, sometimes by being thrown into furnaces, they told us. We had no expectation that this would be part of the work that we were doing, so we asked the government to allow us to conduct a fuller inquiry into that part of the work of the TRC in order to explore that on behalf of the survivors and the Canadian public. We submitted a proposal because it was not within our mandate, and we asked that it be funded by the government, and that request was denied. And so largely we did what we could, but it was not anywhere near what we needed to accomplish and needed to investigate. And now we're beginning to see evidence of the numbers of children who died. We know that there were probably lots of sites similar to Kamloops that are going to come to light in the future. And we need to begin to prepare ourselves for that. Those who are survivors of the residential schools, including the intergenerational survivors, need to understand that this evidence is important to make available to Canada so that Canada can understand the magnitude of what it is that they did and what it is that they contributed to, but also can understand the magnitude of their responsibility to stop hiding the documents, to force the churches who have documents to disclose those documents so that we can get to the truth of that experience. Since the revelation of what was discovered at Kamloops has come to light, I have been inundated with phone calls from survivors by the dozens, if not hundreds now. They've called me, often just to cry, just to tell us, I told you so, I told you that this had happened, and now we're beginning to see it. And in their voices I can hear not only the pain and the anguish, but also the anger that they were feeling about the fact that nobody believed them when they told those stories. And in addition to that, I can also hear their sense that they've lost some hope. They've lost the faint glimmer of hope that maybe the children who they knew did not return maybe had gone away to live somewhere else and still might be found. And now they think that maybe that might not be feasible, that option might not be available, and I can hear that as well. So my heart goes out to the survivors. My heart goes out to the children of survivors and the families of survivors who never made it back. I know this is a hard time, but we must persevere. We must persevere in our continued investigation of what we need to know about these schools. And at the same time, we need to ensure that we work hard to try to put in place healing programs and foundations that will help survivors to be able to gather from time to time in order to share their common experiences. Just like veterans from the wars are allowed to gather together in their own unique places, we need to provide such places for survivors of residential schools as well. So I pray for you all. I hope that you can find a way to be able to continue on with your life in a good and healthy way despite this revelation. I hope that you are able to see that there is something here that we can do about this. Thank you. Miigwech.
The residential schools went much farther back than the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which were the more recent times that we've heard about. But they've been there for generations, and they've had an impact on generations of Aboriginal people in Canada.
She would never ever sit down with us and talk to us about what happened to her there.
Or an artificial community, which is what I would term residential school to be.
Angayuk kam ang nabigaru ilinnaaq tutuqaaqattalaqtillugilli teissumani aullalaqtillunga qanukkiaq Kilamikoronia kasugil tungari Uberonia angayokka kamaringnia kasugil iglurigazum.
Le 17 février 2003, j'avais un de mes amis qui devait recommencer à travailler, mais il n'a jamais recommencé à travailler parce qu'il s'est suicidé une semaine avant. Puis c'était ça, c'était les séquelles du pensionnat, que lui, il n'a jamais été capable de passer à travers.
We have to recognize that this is a part of a great number of people's lives now, whether or not they were at school themselves or whether they lived in communities where these schools were present. It has a huge effect on the lives of Aboriginal people in this country.
In the late 19th century, the Canadian government undertook a formal partnership with church entities to run industrial, boarding, and residential schools for Aboriginal people. The Indian residential school system was designed to impose foreign languages, foreign religions, as well as the values and work skills of Canadian society on Aboriginal children. More than 130 industrial, boarding, and residential schools operated between 1831 and 1996. The schools were operated by various Catholic orders: the Church of England, which later became the Anglican Church, the United Church, the Presbyterians, the Mennonites, the Baptists, and the Salvation Army. The earliest was the Mohawk Indian Residential School, opened in 1831 at Brantford, Ontario. The schools existed in all territories and in all but 3 provinces: New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. In the north, the residential school system also included hostels. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, the bureaucrat in charge of Canada's Indian policy, made attendance at residential school mandatory for all children between the ages of 5 and 15. At the time, he said, "Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic." The missionary Hugh Mackay, writing in 1903, characterized the system itself as an effort to educate and colonize people against their will. The residential school system was part of a deliberate, systemic effort to kill the Indian in the child. This was accomplished by removing generations of children from their families and communities, and by alienating them from their language, culture, and broadly speaking, Aboriginal ways of living in the world. For those traumatized by their experiences in the residential school system, the policy of forced assimilation has resulted in pervasive loss. Loss of identity, loss of family, loss of language, loss of culture. As early as 1907, inspectors called the residential school systems places of disease, hunger, overcrowding, and despair. As late as 1950, according to an Indian Affairs study, over 40% of the teaching staff had no professional training. This is not to say that past experiences were all negative or that all the staff was bad. Such is not the case. Many good and dedicated people worked in the system. Indeed, their willingness to work long hours in an atmosphere of stress and for meager wages was exploited by an administration determined to minimize costs. The staff not only taught, they also supervised the children's work, play, and personal care. Their hours were long, the pay below that of other educational institutions, and the working conditions were exasperating. The residential school system is not alone responsible for the current conditions of Aboriginal communities, but it did play a major role. In the early 1990s, beginning with Phil Fontaine, survivors came forward with disclosures of physical, sexual, and other abuses. Many former students are today pursuing healing and reparation for the humiliations they suffered in residential school. Very gradually, the residential school system was discarded in favor of a policy of integration. Aboriginal students began in the 1940s to attend mainstream schools. The Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development assumed full management of the residential school system on April 1st, 1969. Throughout the 1970s, at the request of the National Indian Brotherhood, government undertook a process that saw the eventual transfer of education to Aboriginal people. In 1970, Blue Quills Residential School became the first residential school managed by Aboriginal people. The last band-run residential school closed in 1996. With the lessons of history in their service, Aboriginal people have begun to heal the wounds of the past.
The way children like me survived residential school, I think, is by never forgetting home and mom and dad. Knowing somebody loved us kept us going. Friends and family do keep us alive.
Moi, j'ai grandi dans un territoire de chasse et pêche qu'on appelle au nord de Parent. Là. Et puis, on était une grosse famille. Je me souviens pas d'avoir eu faim ou d'avoir eu froid. Tu sais. Même si on vivait dans le bois, dans une tente l'été comme l'hiver, j'avais toujours l'essentiel, puis j'étais toujours heureux.
When I was finished, I was probably 12 at the day school, 13. And then after that, I went out, cut wood, fish, trap, did everything else, because on a reserve, when you finished grade 8, you were educated. That was as far as you could go. And for the most part, as my father would say to me, because he'd never gone to school, that I was probably one of the most educated people on a reserve. So stick around and do your thing.
My grandmother was familiar with a lot of the medicines and the plants and things like that, and very well versed still in the stories. But because she was the first one who lived in a residential school, she had it taught to her not to speak the language, and that the language is bad and not useful. And what would happen is that you would reach a certain point when she's giving us some information on something, where she would want to speak or tell a story in Cree because it would be more full or get the point across better. And you could see the struggle going on within her, where she didn't want to do that because she felt that she had bad feelings about Cree and how useful it was going to be for us in the future.
Residential school removed a lot of students for the simple reason that we were poor. But we have to be so careful how we name poverty. The poverty of lack of affection is a real poverty. Lack of affection from parents, for instance, and then our opportunity to love our parents back was certainly one that I felt extraordinarily in residential school.
En 1957, je savais déjà, mon frère le plus vieux puis ma sœur la plus vieille, eux, ils avaient déjà été au pensionnat. Puis je savais qu'au printemps suivant, à l'automne suivant, je veux dire, c'était à mon tour aussi de partir, puis de quitter pour la première fois mon père, ma mère, puis le territoire où j'avais vécu jusqu'à là. J'avais 7 ans. J'étais nerveux, puis en même temps triste aussi, parce que j'allais aller à l'école, puis je ne savais pas trop qu'est-ce qui m'attendait là-bas.
A lot of these children that were coming in, other students were coming in with basically nothing in terms of language and so on. And some of the students that were coming in from the north would come in with grade 8, and when they got tested in the school itself, they'd end up with grade 3 or 4 in terms of the comprehension. And you couldn't really see a lot of these students that are 12, 13, 14, 15 sitting with 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old kids. And there was that conflict all the time. They were separated from their families. They were separated from the extended family and the communities. They didn't get that care and comfort that a family would give. And the sad part of it all is, let's say they stayed away for 10 or 12 years in these residential schools, and then they tried to go back. They couldn't go back because they'd lost all contact with that way of life. If they tried to migrate into the urban settings, they weren't really embraced as they went there either. So they were refugees in their own country.
I know it affected a lot of the children as well. I went to school with, but so much of the time we didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about our feelings in there a lot of the times, although we manifested, we demonstrated our feelings, because there were a lot of muffled sobs around at night.
kahit tiyan ako sa mga tunga natakaw ramol kaya isimang tiyan tayo na ako Diyos kasi yan ito kingamot tao rukrung takwal luwa tao rok si mayo iksarak juan awlet tiyong matayla tawa ni awlet tiyo lakto narulakon ni rok si mayo ila kamagayaw wakto taro nayang nuano.
It was sort of a very regimented life we had there. We got up in the morning, and if you wanted to be on the good side of your superiors, you went to church, which had you up at 5:30 in the morning, and then you had breakfast and went to school, then had lunch and went to school and had dinner.
Kami magkaya pila kita waktu ta jeri yung nukaslak pati ko kay natermin wasa larok luta kanungat ko kildak sak paglutik kullo agat tin ang yukal larok si mangmanin nakano kaya aktigil ni tawang isuanik pigat na tawo nga tekwa ka.
I think for the most part the children felt very powerless. We didn't have the adults, our mothers and fathers and our aunts and our uncles to defend us, so we had to defend ourselves. We had to survive the best way we knew how, and that was to use all our wiles to make sure that we survived. And some of us used things like getting good marks. Others became leaders of the pack, meaning they were the first ones in the lineup where we walked 2 by 2, and they'd be the head of the lineup, and that gave them a certain amount of power and authority and influence. What was so difficult in residential school was the separation you felt from your siblings. Even I as a young girl sat on the girls' side of the dining room, and my brother sat on the other side. And the master being the supervisor of the boys, he would sort of playfully jab at my brother, like hitting him. And that really broke my heart. It was done to humiliate both of us.
Nayagaru sukay mali ungagilak sa magarawak ko kadlin na suklu ukaw tildo nga marigakang ng matakayang ilat ang naigo ang nakuwildo ko ang tikululuyo kanigigiyakan ni mata ilagay karak tildo tayo man na tana udjirilwak si mangmaya.
La coupure qu'il y a eu avec la culture, le territoire, puis la langue, ça faisait que quand tu retournais là-bas, ben, c'était plus pareil. Tu avais presque honte que tu aies vécu de cette façon-là avant. Ça, c'est l'éducation qu'on te donnait pour que tu puisses être un vrai blanc. C'était ça le but. C'était l'assimilation totale pour que la langue ne se parle plus et que les Autochtones, les jeunes, aient honte de leur culture puis de leurs origines. C'est certain qu'on en a perdu beaucoup.
The underlying idea that where they came from, or the ideas or the languages that they had, were less than what the schools were trying to teach them. That the school was doing them a favor by teaching them English and doing them a favor by civilizing them.
The use of the language it wasn't in our case outlawed, but it was frowned upon. And certainly there was a necessity to try to express yourself in English to the best of your ability. Otherwise, it became very difficult to progress.
The discipline and the lack of understanding that they felt. Like, they would talk about, one thing that sticks out is my father grew up left-handed, and he was punished severely, or what you would call severely nowadays, for trying to use his left hand.
But I do think that I used the system in terms of the residential school to promote and get what I wanted. But on the same side of another side of the equation, I felt I was used as well, because I ended up taking care of the animals at the school. I was up early in the morning, 5, 6 o'clock, to milk the cows, do the fields, bale the hay, load the hay, do everything, clean barns. In my case, I saw it as an opportunity to fulfill some of my desires, and having to go through the stuff that I went through was also a necessity for me to fulfill, to get what I wanted. There were 39 of us in grade 9 when I started at the residential school. When I graduated in grade 12, I was all alone. And I would say vehemently that 38 of the students weren't stupid. It was all of the other things that impacted upon them that made it difficult for them to succeed. There was, on certain occasions that I do remember, that the younger ones that tried to run away and never got that far, they were, I'm sure, beaten with either a belt or a willow, and an attempt was made to isolate them and control them a bit more. But that didn't stop them from going again.
For my 7th birthday, my teacher had the students sing Happy Birthday for me, a song I'd never heard before, and in English. And everything, all this English almost was, it didn't sit right with me, because it was so foreign, it was so far removed from my frame of reference, and I was afraid I was being sucked in and being seduced away from home. I remember my mother and father coming to visit us and watching my mother disembark from the wagon, and she had her little red tam on, and she was just beautiful. And I was missing her. Like, I was missing her already. She had just arrived. I missed her already because I knew she was going to go. Separation to this day is a part of me I can't ever come to terms with. I have a great deal of problems with separation. For a young child, residential school didn't make much sense. It was hard to make sense of self, sense of family, sense of community, when it all seemed so contrived, so artificial. You were shut up, you were shut out, you didn't really have a voice, you weren't really heard, and you were shut down. Emotionally, you were shut down because it was too hard to feel. And so when human beings want to make sense of things, we have to feel with all our senses. It has to be a complete sensorial analysis, in my way of thinking. We have to hear, we have to feel, we have to see, we have to touch. And that was shut down in residential school. The way I'm healing, because I don't know if one ever heals from something this traumatic, because it was a traumatic experience. The way I've tried to do it is through living who I am. Living who I am really speaks to my soul and my spirit, and the way I get in touch with my soul and my spirit is through my language. I'm very, very fortunate that somehow or other I was able to retain it. The other big part for me is really always being so profoundly aware of the traditions I was brought up with.
Pour moi, la guérison, je pense que ce serait d'essayer de se reprendre en main.
Ningamangin kadaro tunga nungu ko yurkotok sakadyo mila ila ikpigidyo mila paklu isuma baklu inuit Saraura kasugi nasuk paklu ilangat tirusuri ukaw sa ringitat tinik solo kanitin waktaw waklutik ammaru kallunatu solo ukagok sa titaw makigasuin nakluta ammaru ilangit tigut kunuyok niyaktaw nim anong nakpakluniyoroktok tabunga tikiw tisimaldugo tamak kununga mami sakot tikiw nasuk palilawak ko rin tayo mga 1993 ng tilugo. Ilang anigo ti sumalaklugo ikayo uwan ni solo nanisit tiya kama na magayak ko. Saya manaksu saya madyo manaksawlak lungaro kaso madyo manaksawlak lungaro. Tusak takpakluni ilang ako ilan niya katigay balak lakat tao. Aksawak tu ikayo ko magalwak lugilo kano. Isimak ko ikayo sakto kalwakan lugil. Kano ukakatig ukausong mo luni ilani ko ayong nakapagkalwak lumi. Tabaw to yung nakluni kasi yan ang malo. Ani ko yung ila ikayo kasong nang mo kanitinit yang ng tikiw ti simarak ulat sunga. Dahil nisi.
Je suis content que ce soit déjà derrière nous, toutes ces choses-là, toutes ces années que les gens ont été contraints de partir de chez eux puis aller rester loin de leur famille, à s'ennuyer puis à perdre la culture, la langue. Puis, ça, c'est certain que c'est des choses qu'il ne faut jamais revivre. Je suis content que mes enfants n'aient pas à vivre de ça. Je suis heureux qu'il n'y ait pas aujourd'hui encore un système qui existe là, qui pourrait les éloigner de leur chez eux, là, des gens qu'ils aiment.
It doesn't only haunt me, it haunts my children, it probably haunts my grandchildren. And I'm not sure if I've survived residential school is what I'm saying.
We have to make sure that these are the elements that we're now including in our lives, that we have to become the role models, that we have to treat our own children in a good way, and that we have to be willing to talk and to reveal and to engage. Otherwise, nothing ever changes.
We have a real inclination, a real moral duty and obligation, I think, to heal, not just to heal ourselves, but to heal others. And we might even be better at healing others than we are at healing ourselves. Because again, that's to me a very cultural thing, is to take care of one another.
I would like to think that I can have some impact upon the aspirations of Aboriginal people. In 1962, there were 4 Aboriginal people in university across the country. Well, something has changed dramatically since 1962. And if it took 4 people to open the doors, so be it.
The round dance, like powwows, going to sweats, participating in ceremonies, those are all things that are healing. Just passing on the language is something that provides respect, self-respect, and healing and pride in where we came from.
On January 7th, 1998, Jane Stewart, Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs, issued a Statement of Reconciliation and unveiled a new initiative called Gathering Strength, Canada's Aboriginal Action Plan. A cornerstone of Gathering Strength was the announcement of a $350 million healing fund. Church entities have apologized for their roles in the residential school system. Some even created their own healing funds. On March 31st, 1998, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation was created. It was given 4 years to disperse the Healing Fund and 6 years to monitor and evaluate the projects. The current mandate of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation will end on March 31st, 2009. Since June 1999, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation has been funding community-based initiatives that address the intergenerational legacy of physical and sexual abuse arising from Canada's residential school system. To sustain the healing work, even if the Aboriginal Healing Foundation is gone, the Legacy of Hope Foundation was established in 2001 by the Aboriginal Healing Foundation's Board of Directors. The Legacy of Hope Foundation works in conjunction with and will build on the successes of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Through the AHF, Aboriginal people affected by the residential school legacy have begun to address the effects of unresolved trauma in meaningful ways. Survivors and their families have begun to break the cycle of abuse and to enhance their capacity as individuals, families, communities, and nations to sustain their well-being and that of future generations. Some have even begun the process of reconciliation with Canadians. It is clear that the legacy of the residential school system goes far beyond survivors, and that, despite all the progress that has been made over the past decade, there is still a long way to go. The impacts continue to be felt by Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children and grandchildren, communities, and nations.